Today we're going to be learning about some of our literary terms, specifically our plot terms. Plot refers to the sequence of events in a narration. Sometimes it's called the storyline. Plot typically begins with exposition. This is the author's presentation of important background information. It will often include an introduction to our main characters and the setting. As you can see here, exposition is represented by the flat green line. Nothing has really happened yet, so that's why we're still at a flat line. Exposition usually takes place at the beginning of the story, as I mentioned. However, an author may choose to add more exposition at later points in the text, where you learn more about characters' background. So we will likely meet our protagonist, our main character, the hero or the heroine during our exposition, and we will also likely meet our antagonist, a character or a force who creates opposition to the protagonist. This will lead to conflict later in the story. We are also likely to learn about our setting, the time and place. However, the author may not directly state the time and the place. Sometimes the reader has to make inferences during the exposition about where and when a story takes place. You may be wondering, does a story always have exposition? Actually, no. Sometimes a story leaves out the exposition and actually starts right in the middle of the action. If you read the Iliad this summer, you would have noticed in Medias Res, the story began in the middle, or actually towards the end, of the Trojan War. In this case, the reader will need to make inferences about the background. This is called reconstructed past. Unlike exposition, which is provided by the author, reconstructed past refers to the reader's perception of the background. The reader can use clues in the text to make inferences about what may have happened in a character's past, or what may have happened before the story began. So after exposition, the background information about our characters, we're going to move into the rising action. The rising action is represented by this green line moving up the peak. This includes all of the events up until the climax. And typically the rising action is the bulk of the story. Most of the events in the story will take place in the rising action. The rising action will start with an initiating event, some moment that actually sets the plot in motion. Without this moment, the rest of the story couldn't take place. Rising action may also include a lot of suspense. Any moment in the text that's making the reader wonder, what's going to happen next? Or how is this going to work out? Any of those moments when you feel like you're on the edge of the seat, or you think, don't go through that door, or that's not a good decision. This is likely suspense. So if suspense makes you wonder what's going to happen next, foreshadowing are actually the clues that hint towards what will happen next. If you use foreshadowing, you might even be able to figure out what's going to happen towards the end of the story. Rising action might also include a flashback, which is an interruption in the rising action, showing an earlier event from a character's past, although not all stories have flashbacks. So as we said, the rising action is the bulk of the story, and it will also include a conflict or a series of conflicts. This is the struggle or problem between two forces or characters. So what starts the conflict? A complication. A complication is a point where the central character, the protagonist, meets opposition, maybe the antagonist. It's the beginning of the conflict. And we have two different types of conflict. We can have an internal conflict, which is a psychological or emotional struggle within the character's mind. This is called character versus self. So the character may be struggling with self-doubt, or the character may have a big decision to make, or the character may have a moral struggle between right and wrong. All of these would be examples of internal conflict. We can also have external conflict, which is a struggle between a character and an outside force. So it could be the protagonist versus the antagonist, character versus character. It could be the protagonist versus some natural element, a huge storm, or the character is stranded on an island. This might be character versus nature. It could be the character versus a group of people or a whole community, character versus society. Or it could be a character versus some type of supernatural element like fate or a god. So as the character is struggling through this conflict or these series of conflicts in the rising action, eventually everything will culminate in the climax, represented by the green dot at the peak of our plot line. This is the point of greatest emotional intensity. Everything has built to this point. So if we've reached the peak at the climax, now we need to start going back down the plot line in the falling action. This is the events after the climax. It's where everything starts to calm down and we're moving towards resolution of the conflict. In this particular plot line, it looks like the falling action will be the same length as the rising action. But keep in mind, in some stories, the falling action is very short or non-existent. After the calming down period, we're moving into the resolution, which is basically the conclusion or the solution at the end of the story. This is where the problem will be solved or untied, unknotted. A synonym for resolution is the French word dénouement, which literally means unknotting. So imagine this huge tangled mess that has been created in the conflict that's finally been untangled, unknotted in the resolution or dénouement. So at the end of a story, the reader has the opportunity to project what might happen next. This is called projected future. The reader can make inferences about what happens to the characters after the story's conclusion. This is when you figure out what's next for the character. Maybe what have they learned, or what would they do after the story ends. If you really fall in love with a character, you might wish that the story could continue, that the author would tell us more about their next chapter. But instead, as readers, we have the responsibility to project the character's future in the projected future. So that concludes our plot line. Again, as you can see, it often looks like a plot line will be symmetrical, with the rising action and the falling action being the same length. But keep in mind, many stories don't have very much falling action or might not have any at all. And some stories might leave out the resolution as well, leaving only the projected future that the reader creates to decide what happens at the end. Thanks for listening. Until next time.